Right. Good morning, everyone. How are we doing today?
Good, good, good.
I know.
Yeah,
Sleepy but good.
good. So let's see. Last book circle before we go to the break. So, any thoughts on this week's uh, chapters? Many of them actually are related to things that I tell you over and over again. Who knows what that is? Yeah, who knows what that is? What is
Code
one
is
thing that I, go
code
ahead,
is
yeah?
design. That's the one that mentions a lot of the stuff. Make the
Yeah,
code
but
readable,
what do I say that we developers spend more time doing?
reading code.
Reviewing
Reading
the code.
code, reading code than writing code. Therefore, what should be one of your priorities when you're writing your code?
That is readable.
You have to make sure that it's readable. Yeah? Andre, go ahead.
What I understand is more important when they write something code upon something function. The name we give for the function. We write the intent of the function,
Exactly.
values,
Exactly.
function, everything.
Exactly. So it's not only about the name of the function, it's more than that. That's one component, of course. But the essence, I would say the essence of this set of chapters that we read, it's about the importance of writing code that it's readable, code that is readable, because it's not only going to help you, but it's going to help other people. And then all the different chapters that we're going to go one by one, uh, they elaborate on the topic of readability and understandability of the code. So let's begin with from the back, coding with reason. In here, this is in this part, the author writes a number of suggestions that you should take into account whenever you're writing code. And many of these suggestions, we have been speaking about them through the code. The good thing is that everyone here is or belongs to the Android, which means you know Kotlin, which means because Python works a little bit differently in this aspect. So when you create your variables, for example, should you make them mutable or immutable?
Immutable when unless is. By
Exactly.
default,
You should,
immutable.
yeah, but you should try as much as possible to create a solution that involves using immutable, which is what this person says in here. What about functions? How should your functions be in terms of responsibility of the function? How many responsibilities should a function do?
One and one only, if possible.
No, not if possible. It should be one. Yeah,
Mhm.
because if your function starts to do more than one stuff, I mean, yeah, it can do it. It's not a problem. But then when you want to understand that function, when you want to debug that function, it could be a little bit problematic. So yes, when you create your functions, now this is something that it's very easy to say. I have to admit, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, let's create a function that only does one thing. But when you're actually coding the stuff, you don't realize it, but unintentionally, and I say unintentionally because I don't think no one, well, maybe some people do, but no one has the intention of writing very bad code. Yeah, you always have the best intentions, but that doesn't mean that you're going to actually achieve that. So you write a function, and in the moment, you think that your function is only doing one thing, but it's really subtle. It could actually be doing more than one. So it's something that, remember, at the end of the day, programming, it's about refactoring. So yeah, you create the first version, but at some point you might realize, wait a minute, this is not doing one thing. This is actually doing two things. I have to break this up into parts, into two different functions, for example. But yeah, you should always aim for that. Always aim for short, focused, and single. Um, in here, I have a question. I want to see what you think about this. The author says in page 31, functions should have few parameters. The word few is subjective, that's not a real value. Uh, what do you consider few? What is few?
As a
Anyone?
as parameters for a function, Yeah, he mentions 4. He mentions
Yeah.
4,
But
but
okay. Mhm.
more than 4, maybe you can make a class, a data class to hold the parameters and just pass the class as a parameter.
Okay, I like that. Khaled, you were gonna say?
Maybe his reason is when you call the function, then you need to pass the argument. It's something looking for, depends on the number of the parameters that you included on the function. So
Exactly.
he mentioned 4, but
Yeah.
yes.
But the truth is, there will be times in which you might have to pass more than 4. What do we do? That is, Enrique mentioned it. One way of handling that is you create a class where you kind of encapsulate those parameters. And usually, if you see, and this is not what he intended to express here, but it's a good way of linking it. Let's say that you have a number of functions. It doesn't matter how many, but let's say you have a number of functions, and you realize that to all of those functions, they do different things, but every time you call those functions, you're passing the same information, the same 4 parameters. That is an indication that maybe those 4 parameters are closely related, and you can encapsulate them into a class so that instead of passing all those 4 independently, you pass the class itself. So that is one way of addressing the issue and doing some refactoring to improve the readability of your code. And of course, when you call it, you don't have to be passing 4 things, you pass only 1 thing. Good. Variable names. What did here I like this stuff because with many of you I have had this conversation of, okay, Humberto, if my code is not readable, let me just write some comments. But I always say no. Make your code, and he wrote it on bullet point number 1, 2, 3, 4. Make the code self-documenting by choosing descriptive names. So saying that I'm going to make my code readable just by writing comments, that is not the solution. That means you're not putting the effort, the energy that is required to really come up with good naming that could help your code be self-documenting. I mean, remember that you do not want to rely on comments to be able for people, because then you're eventually, and trust me, it will happen eventually, your comments will go one way, your code will go another way, and then it's going to be total chaos, because then who do I trust? Should I change the code to do what the comment says, or change the comments to do what the code says? You see? So yes, every now and then you might have to put some comments, some documentation, but do not use documentation as codes as a substitute for good naming, because that is not the approach. And once again, it's also easier said than done. It's easier to say, oh, this is clear. Yeah, this is clear in this particular moment because I'm fresh. I have the ideas fresh. The domain is fresh for me. It's super clear. But after 2 weeks, I come back and I don't understand half the thing I wrote. Yeah. And I'm confident it has happened to all of you at some point, right? Writing the applications. You are in the moment and you say, okay, this is very clear. I know what this is doing. Comes the weekend, you leave the code, you come back on Monday, and you're like, what is this? I don't understand. And it happens to me all the time. Like I have to constantly be, or it could also be this. It could also not be that it's not clear because let's say you were lazy or anything like that. But as you advance in the project, you're going to learn more about the project. And what you thought was an appropriate name at a specific moment in time, as you learned more, as the project evolved, you realize, this is actually not a good name. Not because it's unclear, but because you have learned more about it, about the project, and you realize this is a better name for this given scenario because now I know more about the project. So it's a process. And I always go in with the mindset of most likely this name will change, but at least for now, I am happy with its current state. You see, I am happy with the current state. Any questions on that? Any thoughts on that? I want to hear from you.
It's supposed to be, he mentioned that about reviewing the code. I mean,
Yes.
we, from our perspective, it's a good naming, but actually others not find it's a good name or not understandable. So yeah, we need another opinion.
Yeah. So the thing about we will speak more deeply about contributes in just a second, but at the end of the day, I would say that let's say you're in your team. When you're doing your review as a team, you have to agree, okay, this is we consider as a team that this is a good name. Is it perfect? Maybe not. If someone new comes to the team, maybe they might disagree. But again, just like many other aspects of life, if it's good or not depends on who you ask. And in order for you to make a decision, you just have to say, okay, given the team, given the context, how satisfied do we feel about this? We feel good. Okay, let's move on. You see? So we agree. So again, remember, software is like an organism that is always evolving. So sometimes I'm in a coding session and I say, look, I know this is not the perfect solution and I know there is something better out there. But at this moment in time, I feel satisfied with this. I'm going to leave it like this. And when I advance in other areas, I will come back and see what I can do. But at the very least, I am conscious that I know this is the best I can come up with at this moment in time. And then I move on. So at some point, you just have to say, look, I'm happy with this refactoring. It's okay. Maybe I would change it later. It's okay. Andre, go ahead, and then Murad.
Yes, you talk about which point, important topic. The challenge is more when you're working in the team. I can say my example, internship, the 50% of the time we spend in the meetings is more in refactor, organize code, and decide the name for the function. Because the name the another person give for the function that makes sense, but maybe for you don't make sense. So you need to a little discuss. So okay, which the name is perfect for that. So the challenge when you're working alone and you decide the name, it's you. But when you're working with 2, 3, 4 peoples, you need to make sure that everyone agree about the name, understand the name.
Yeah, it's part of that code review that as a team you feel happy with the implementation. And yeah, and I would say that's not a problem. That is just the nature of working as a team. When I'm by myself, of course, I make the decisions myself, and who's gonna tell me no? But when we are as a team, yeah, as a team, we come up with what we believe it's a better naming. Which, in my opinion, it usually, although it could result in differences of opinion, usually it does push for a better naming. Eventually, if it's a healthy discussion, then it usually do results in a better result. And the keyword here is healthy, because sometimes they are not done properly, and at the end everyone is mad with everyone, and you just put whatever so that you can shut up and continue. But if everyone knows that the purpose is to do better and they take some good practices, then yeah. But it's absolutely right what Andre says. Yeah. Munat, go ahead.
Hi,
You're
everyone.
muted. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just demuted it. I had just a question about something else, but I can add something about that. That's maybe with the more experience and more practice on several projects in the future. Maybe that can be helpful, yeah, to choose really a readable function name or a variable name. Maybe I guess so. And my question here, I see a sentence. If you need a nested section, make it a function. What do you mean by that?
Which point is it?
Is
What
exactly
page?
is it is under the same paragraph you mentioned before? So is in 31. Let me see. 31, yeah.
Yeah, but which bullet point?
Is
1,
2,
2,
4,
3,
5.
4, 5, 5. Number 5.
If
Make
you
your
need
function short.
If you need a nested section, make it a function.
no, sorry, it's on page 31.
31.
Yeah, that's right. If you need a nested section, make it a function. Yes. So sometimes what I believe he refers to this is You can have, let's say, imagine you have a piece of code and you have, you know what we mean by nested. Like, for example, you have a if statement, and that if statement is inside a for loop. And just to make it a little bit more complex, let's say that that for loop is inside another for loop, as an example. So you have
That's right.
nested stuff, something inside something. So to improve clarity, the nested aspects could be extracted into a function. So let's say, for example, we have a for loop, and inside that for loop, we are doing, just to keep it simple, 10 lines of code that it's supposed to increment some values in a list. Just let's keep it simple. Well, what we can do is we have the for loop, and those 10 lines, instead of keeping it there, we extract that logic into a function. So then our for loop will only be doing, quote unquote, one thing, which is calling that function. Hopefully then that function is named in such a way that you understand what's going on. So for example, if we are speaking about the lines of incrementing values, we say for loop, blah, blah, blah. And inside we say increment value, and then we pass whatever we might need to pass. So again, we are extracting logic into functions so that it becomes easier to read the code. I mean, your functions should be like a story. Like, I should be able to read your code from top down, and it should feel like a story, in the sense that every function is named in such a way that I know exactly what's happening. You see, like, for example, and that's why for loops are so important. Like in Kotlin, at least, you know how we have like students dot for each student, and then inside increment grade, you call the function increment grade. I mean, it reads like a book. But now, if instead of that lambda variable, you call it I, and instead of student, you call it S, then you have a code that reads S dot for each I, and then instead of increment grade, you have increment. S for each I increment. What the hell am I incrementing? You see what I mean? If you instead call it students dot for each student increment grade for this student, I mean, I don't care how you're doing it. I know exactly what's happening. And that is why variable naming is so important. And that goes to the aspect, I believe this is what he meant, of nesting. Instead of keeping the code of incrementing the grade inside the for loop, I extract it into a function, and then I can read it, because otherwise I will be forced to kind of read those 10 lines in order for me to know, this for loop is incrementing the grade of each student. But if I extract it into a function, it will read beautifully. And that is what you need to think of. You have to think of many things, but one of, how does my code read? You try to ask yourself, if someone were to read this code, is it clear to read? Is this like a book, like a really nice novel? Or is this a horror story that they're reading, that they don't understand anything? You see, that is a question that I ask myself frequently. I try, and I say try because, of course, you already have knowledge that the other person might not have. You read your code. How does this read? Okay, this reads nice. It's clear what is happening. And if you go to page 22, this is the best example. Page 22. In the first code, he says like, if portfolio ID by, I mean, it's a horrible code. But then in the bottom, in the third, is if trader dot can view portfolio. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful code, in the sense of, when you read it, it's like just reading English. You don't feel that you're really reading code. If in the third one, the one more to the lowest, it says if trader dot can view portfolio. And that thing is supposed to do the same thing as the first example. But you tell me which one is clearer. Of course, the second one, because it reads like a book. It reads nicely, and you have to get used to that. You have to get used to, and here's the key, and we have spoken about this: hide implementation details. You hide implementation details, because what do I mean by implementation details? If you look at the first example, when I was reading this, I knew we were dealing something about maps, because he was saying something. I mean, when you read the code, it is leaking implementation details about IDs of portfolios and IDs of trailers, and if it contains a key. Why do I need to know all those details? Well, technically speaking, I shouldn't. Even though, yeah, I'm writing the code, or I'm reading the code. Why do I need to know that? You're just making it harder for me to understand. Hide the implementation details. In this case, hide this information about keys and map behind a function called canView. You see what I mean? This is the key. You want to hide implementation details. And a problem that I see, and this is normal, I mean, you're learning, but feedback here. A lot of students, when they write their function names, they leak implementation details. What do I mean? I read the function name and I know if they're using a list, not because of the parameters, but just by the function name. I know if they're using a list, or I know if they're using a map. You see, because the name of the function is leaking information. I know from a function name if they're what library they are using, if they're using retrofit, for example, and that is leaking implementation detail. Who cares if you're using rooms? Who cares if you're using retrofit? That has to be hidden. Instead, you say, as an example, save user. Who cares where this thing is saved? If it's saved in room, in data store, in the cloud, who cares? The function name should not reflect that, because if tomorrow, for example, if you said save in room, as an example, and tomorrow you decide to not use room, guess what's going to happen to your function? It's going to be obsolete, because now you don't only need to change the implementation of not using room, but now I'm also forced to change the name of the function because I'm not using rooms anymore. But if you have kept it save user and you and you change the database, then at least the name of that function doesn't need to change because you're still saving. The only thing that changed was the behind the scenes, how you were saving. And again, this is easier said than done, but you need to keep it fresh in your mind. When you're writing your code, am I leaking implementation here? The same for variable names. A lot of students say like student map. Why do I need to know that it's a map? Who cares that it's a map? If tomorrow you decided to make it a class, are you going to call it student class? Student data class? No, just call it student. How is the student created? No one cares. No one cares. I mean, when I say no one cares, what I mean is that the reader of your code doesn't need to interest about that. If they do, they should then go into the implementation. But when you're reading, it should just read nicely. For example, going back to page 22, if trader canView, that's perfect. If I really want to know what is canView doing, then I go to it. But I don't need to feel forced to read all this implementation to understand your code. You see what I mean here with the hiding details? Khaled, yes.
Yeah, I think the pseudocode and the writing, the algorithm is helping with naming a lot on this.
Definitely. It can definitely help. And again, don't feel frustrated. This is something that it's nature, in the sense of, remember how we always do, just make it work and then you do refactoring. That is the approach that you need to take. When I write my own code for my own projects, my own stuff, in the beginning, it depends also on the specifics, but in the beginning I focused let's just make this thing work. I don't care how ugly it is. I just needed to make it work. And once I have a working version, I say, okay, now that it's working, now that I have tests in place, let's start refactoring. And I feel that that is the part where people don't take the extra step. They say, okay, it's working, it's passing, I can move on. No, yeah, in the context of this education, that might work, okay? You might be able to still get a good grade, but you're not here only to get a good grade. You're here to go to the industry. And in the industry, that's not going to pass. People are going to tell you, this is not acceptable. This is not good. Bad variable naming, bad function naming. You have to get used to it now, basically. But very good, very good. Let's go really quickly on code review. How did it go for those in the internship? Andrea, you already mentioned that you did code review with whom you were. How did it go? You were doing code reviews in that sense. What else did you guys do?
So basically, in my college, they have decide one behavior and one define another behavior. When we met, we share the behavior. So I take the keyboard I say, okay, Edwin, now I will review your code. I will refactor, I will not refactor, but I will change the names, organize like the book to understand my size. And after we discuss, okay, you understand also, you agree, and we test, and Edwin do the same with my code. So in that, instead, I'm in one step, in one time, I decide instead I need to read the code or you need to explain your code. I prefer take your code, trying to read, trying to refactor, trying to improve to understand. So that is the way we use it.
What about you, Khaled? How did it go with you and Eric? Did you guys do the same approach, or how did you, help or
Actually,
review it?
because we worked a little bit separately on the tasks, but when I push and commit to the repository, then you read the code. Actually, when I read it, I find it okay, perfect. I understand it because I wrote it, and then I surprised that there is something not clear. What's this? How is this done? What do you mean by this? And this is make me to read it again and try to improve it. And this is, as you said, it's easy to say, not to implement. It will be hard when you're coming to implement that.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for other people. I mean, when you're working on your own projects, that's okay, but when you're in the industry, that's why it's so important for other people to see your code, because we think, okay, this is super clear. Of course, it's clear. I created the thing, but it's not until other pair of eyes see your code, they have their own perspective about things. They realize, or they will start asking questions. You realize, okay, I thought this was clear that I meant this, but hey, I was not. I thought that I was clear, but it seems that it's not as clear as I thought it was. Because again, you have background context that the other person necessarily doesn't have. So I would say it's not a problem. It's natural. It's normal. Good. We're running a little bit out of time, but code layout. We already know detect. Hopefully from now on, everyone implements detect on their own projects. You create a project and the first thing you do, boom, configure detect. But detect is only one aspect to it. It's one aspect. The other aspect is how there are certain things that detect doesn't detect. Yeah. For example, indentation sometimes, line space, or when to put space in between lines. You need to, the way you write code is very important, because if you write all the code like no spacing in between them, that could be very hard to follow. So at the same time, if you create hundreds of lines in between, that's also the other extreme. But you do want to kind of create little blocks, so that when I see your code, and when I see, I mean, not read it, but just by seeing it, I see, oh, there are different blocks here. Most likely all these blocks are kind of different ideas, if you will. The same when you write a letter or an email, for that matter. I mean, nowadays, people just write a block of text that I'm forced to read. But if you are a good writer, ideally, you're going to separate into paragraphs, so that it's not only visually pleasing to read that, or when you receive that, but also, ideally, each paragraph is supposed to be an idea. The same with code. Instead of you writing, I don't know, 10 lines back to back, most likely those lines do different stuff and they are gathered. So you see that whenever we write the solutions in class, usually in the top, we create our variables. Val result equals la la la. Then we have at least one line and we do kind of the analysis, the for loop and the stuff that we do. And then we have a new line when we do the return. So we have 3 areas where we initialize our stuff, when we do kind of the logic, if you will, and then when we return the value. I don't know if you have noticed, I don't put everything on like back to back. It's so that it's visually understandable that there are different ideas. And within the for loop, assuming we're using a for loop, we do the same thing. We kind of separate ideas using lines. And that's, so I believe you guys are relatively good at that from the code that I have seen, but still it can be improved. So remember, lines are your best friends. Do not overdo them. That's one extreme. The other extreme will be having too little. Having too little. Good. Any last, because I have to get going, any last few words before we keep it here? We close it for today.
It's actually really good.
Yeah. So I
Oh,
really
it was
hope
good.
that I really hope you get this. And again, it's about a matter of practicing. The more you practice, but the important thing, keep it in your head. Keep it in your head. It's not only about making it work, but making it work and making it readable. Yeah. Really nice. Okay, so with that said, thank you everyone. No book circle next week, but in
January.
yeah, we start again. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good one,
Okay.
then.
Yeah.
Have a
Hey,
nice
Dom.
one.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.